ordinary Africans, it feels like the dawn of something long overdue: dignity, unity, and sovereignty. And now the question is bigger than Namibia or Zambia. With Botswana already in the fold and whispers of Angola, Zimbabwe, even South Africa watching closely, could this be the beginning of Southern Africa's own revolution for sovereignty, echoing what the Sahel Alliance has already proven possible? Could Africa truly be on the cusp of rewriting its destiny, led not by fear, but by courage? My friends, this is not just another headline. This is history in motion. Stay with us as we dive deeper into what President Netumbo Nandinua has unleashed and why the West is scrambling to contain it. Please share this video if you believe Africa deserves to tell its own story. And don't forget to subscribe, because the truth matters more than the headlines. When Netumbo Nandinua took the presidential oath in Windhoek on March 21, 2025, many expected the usual fanfare of speeches and ceremonial pledges. But what followed stunned not only Namibians but Africans across the continent. Within weeks of assuming power, she began dismantling what she described as the invisible prison of colonialism, and she started at the border. On October 24, 2023, during Zambia's 59th Independence Day celebrations in Windhoek, Namibia's Minister of Home Affairs, Albert Kawana, announced what at first sounded like a technical adjustment. Zambians and Namibians, he declared, would soon be allowed to cross their shared border using only their national ID cards. No passports required. To the untrained ear, this may have seemed like an administrative tweak, the kind of policy change that bureaucrats quietly slip into law. But in reality, it was nothing less than a bombshell, a direct strike at the artificial borders carved in Berlin in 1884, when European powers drew lines across a continent they did not own. For the poor farmer in Kadama Mulilo, who sells tomatoes across the river in Zambia, this policy means no more paying for passports he cannot afford. For the small trader in Sesheke who carries fabric and maize into Namibia, it means freedom of movement without humiliating barriers. For families divided by a line on a colonial map, it means reconnection, community, and dignity. Suddenly, the border is no longer a wall, but a bridge. This move did not come out of nowhere. It built upon an earlier agreement between Namibia and Botswana, where citizens already crossed with their ID cards. By extending the model to Zambia, President Nandinua was signaling a larger vision: step-by-step, one border at a time. Southern Africa could tear down the walls that Europe left behind and stitch together a new fabric of unity. But the symbolism went even deeper. To millions of Africans, the passport is not just a travel document. It is a barrier designed to keep them small, fragmented, and dependent. It costs money, time, and bureaucracy that many rural citizens will never have. By bypassing it, Nandinua was declaring that African identity does not need a foreign stamp of approval. The ID card itself becomes a weapon of emancipation, a simple yet powerful reminder that Africans belong where their roots and relationships tie them, not where colonial ink once divided them. And the impact of this decision goes far beyond social convenience. Economically, it aligns perfectly with the Walvis Bay Ndola Lubumbashi Development Corridor, a strategic trade route that links Namibia's Atlantic port to Zambia's Copper Belt and the mineral-rich Democratic Republic of Congo. By removing passport restrictions, trade flows are expected to accelerate, boosting exports, tourism, and small-scale commerce. Analysts in Lusaka and Windhoek have already projected that the move will cut informal trade costs by as much as 30%, unlocking prosperity for thousands of families who live on either side of the border. Of course, the West immediately recognized the danger. For decades, their dominance in Africa has relied on the continent's fragmentation. Divided nations are easier to manipulate their resources, easier to plunder their leaders, easier to pressure. But if Southern Africa begins to integrate, if uranium from Namibia, copper from Zambia, and diamonds from Botswana flow within a united economic bloc, then Africa will no longer be forced to beg for entry into the Western marketplace. Instead, it can negotiate from a position of strength. The fear in Western capitals was not misplaced. The ID card pact was not just a border deal. It was a declaration of intent. President Nandinua was telling the world that Namibia would no longer be trapped in someone else's system, and she was not alone. By drawing in Zambia and Botswana, she created the nucleus of a Southern African alliance that could soon rival the Sahel's ace bloc of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The parallels were striking, and the momentum was undeniable. For Namibians, this was only the beginning. They had elected not just a president, but a reformer who dared to move fast, break barriers, and remind the continent that sovereignty is not a slogan, but a lived reality. In that moment, with one signature and one bold declaration, the seeds of Southern Africa's own emancipation were sown. If the border reforms lit the first flame, it was President Netumbo Nandinua's next moves that turned it into a roaring fire. With barely a month in office, she took a step that most African leaders would not even dare to whisper about. She nationalized Namibia's oil and gas sector. On March 22, 2025, the day after her inauguration celebrations ended, she announced that management of the entire industry, including offshore oil fields, projected to pump 700,000 barrels per day by 2030, would now fall directly under the office of the president. The shock was immediate. Total Energies and Shell, the foreign giants that had long dictated the terms of Namibia's resources, were stripped of control overnight. In European capitals, panic set in. How could a small southern African country suddenly seize the wheel of its most strategic industry? How could a 72-year-old woman whom many in the West had dismissed as a ceremonial figure stare down multi-billion-dollar corporations and refuse to blink? Inside Namibia, the reaction could not have been more different. In the townships of Windhoek, crowds gathered to cheer her name. On radio call-in shows, ordinary workers expressed pride that their oil would no longer flow exclusively to foreign markets while their children lived in poverty. For them, this was not an act of economic vandalism. It was justice long delayed. But Nandinua was only getting started. In April 2025, she reopened one of the darkest wounds of Africa's colonial past by demanding a full apology and reparations from Germany for the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples between 1904 and 1908. Over 100,000 Africans were slaughtered in that brutal campaign, yet Berlin's reconciliation gestures over the years had been symbolic at best. In a fiery interview with the BBC, Nandinua dismissed Germany's efforts as insulting and inadequate. Our ancestors' blood, she declared, cannot be appeased by half measures. The demand rattled Europe. German officials scrambled to contain the diplomatic fallout, but the message was unmistakable. Namibia under Nandinua would not be a quiet partner in forgetting history. She had reopened a conversation that many Western governments hoped was buried forever. Then, in August 2025, she stunned the world yet again. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had proposed conducting trials of a new 8-year hormonal intrauterine device, IUD, in Namibia. For years, Africa had been used as a testing ground for Western pharmaceutical experiments. Nandinua stood before her people and rejected the plan outright. Namibia's women are not guinea pigs, she said. Our future is not a laboratory. The statement went viral across Africa's social media platforms. Hashtags praising her courage trended for days. Women's rights groups hailed her as a defender of dignity. And once more, Western governments found themselves on the defensive, accused of treating African lives as disposable. Each of these decisions built upon the last, escalating both admiration at home and hostility abroad. In Windhoek and Lusaka, people called her a heroine. In Paris, London, and Washington, whispers grew darker. Analysts predicted sanctions. Journalists speculated about destabilization campaigns. Posts on X even claimed, though unverified, that she had expelled 500 Americans from Namibia, a rumor that spread like wildfire and revealed just how much the world believed she was willing to go head-to-head with the West. The reactions were polar opposites. At home, Nandinua was seen as fearless, incorruptible, the long-awaited leader who would not bow. Abroad, she was labeled reckless, dangerous, even dictatorial. Yet in the clash of narratives, one truth became clear: she had broken through the silence that usually suffocates African politics. She had forced the world to pay attention. The climax of her early presidency was not just in the boldness of her reforms, but in the storm they unleashed. By taking control of Namibia's oil, demanding justice from Germany, and rejecting Western medical trials, Nandinua positioned herself as a leader of uncompromising sovereignty. She was not waiting for permission. She was making history in real time. And as the cheers of her people grew louder, so too did the growl of Western discontent. Namibia was no longer a quiet corner of Africa. It had become the epicenter of a struggle between independence and control, between dignity and exploitation. The lioness had roared, and the world was listening. The ripple effects of President Netumbo Nandinua's bold agenda were immediate and far-reaching. They were not confined to boardrooms in Europe or the headlines of Western newspapers. They were felt in the daily lives of ordinary Namibians, farmers, students, unemployed youth, and working mothers who had long waited for a government that would put their needs first. One of her earliest milestones was the unveiling of Namibia's 6th National Development Plan (NDP6) in July 2025. Far from being a document of lofty promises, NDP6 was a roadmap to real independence. It aimed to diversify the economy away from raw exports, set annual growth targets, and restore Namibia's status as an upper-middle-income nation by 2030. For too long, Namibia's minerals had left its soil unprocessed, enriching others, while its own people remained poor. Under Nandinua's vision, that cycle would be broken. She promised investments in agriculture, value-added manufacturing, and local energy production. The goal was clear: to ensure that Namibia's natural wealth would be transformed into jobs, industries, and livelihoods at home. Her social reforms were equally groundbreaking. In her State of the Nation address on April 24, 2025, she announced that starting in 2026, tertiary education would be free for Namibian citizens. At the same time, she launched a $257 million youth business fund to combat the staggering 44.4% youth unemployment rate and unveiled a national internship program designed to equip graduates with practical skills. Families cheered when she pledged to build 10,000 units of low-cost housing each year in Windhoek, easing one of the country's most painful shortages. For a generation that had grown disillusioned, these reforms restored hope that the state could